Book 29. 1. On reaching Sicily, Scipio formed his volunteers into ranks and centuries. 300 of them young men in their prime and of outstanding physical strength. He kept around him unarmed, and he left them ignorant of why they were being kept in reserve, and not put into sentries or given weapons. Then he assembled the 300-strong cavalry force to cross with him to Africa, selecting young men of superior family and means from all over Sicily, and he fixed a date on which they were to appear, equipped and furnished with horses and weapons. Such a campaign, far from home, struck them as a grim prospect, and they thought it would expose them to many hardships and much danger on both land and sea, and their parents and relatives too, not just the conscripts, were prey to such anxiety. When the appointed day arrived, the men appeared with their weapons and mounts. Then Scipio announced that he was receiving reports that a number of Sicilian horsemen were alarmed at the thought of such a campaign, which they expected to be onerous and demanding. If that was how they felt, he said, he preferred them to stay so right now rather than to find them grumbling later on, and turning out to be half-hearted soldiers of no use to the Republic. They should therefore speak their minds, and they would get a sympathetic hearing from him. When one of the men found the courage to say that, given the choice, he certainly would not want to serve, Scipio said to him, "Well, young man, since you have not concealed your feelings, I shall provide a replacement for you. You are to transfer him, your weapons, your horse, and all the other military equipment. You are to take him home with you from here right away, train him, and see that he is schooled in horsemanship and armed combat." The man gladly accepted the conditions, and Scipio entrusted to him one of the 300 men he was keeping unarmed. When the others saw the horsemen freed from service with the commander's approval, they all asked to be excused, and all accepted a replacement. So it was that Roman horsemen replaced the 300 Sicilians without state expense. The Sicilians took responsibility for their instruction and training, because the commander had ordered that anyone who failed to do this would have to take on the service himself. They say that the cavalry squadron turned out to be superb, providing assistance for the Republic in numerous battles. Scipio then conducted an inspection of the legions and selected from them soldiers with the largest number of campaigns to their credit, and especially those who had served under Marcellus. These, he believed, were the men who had received the finest training and who were, thanks to their long blockade of Syracuse, the most adept in besieging cities. For it was no minor operation that Scipio had in mind. He had already contemplating the destruction of Carthage. He then distributed his troops amongst the towns and requisitioned the grain from the city-states of Sicily, making sparing use of that imported from Italy. He refurbished old ships and sent Gaius Laelius to Africa on raiding expeditions with them. His new ships he drew up on shore at Panormus to pass the winter on dry land, because they had been hurriedly put together from timber that was still green. Having completed his preparations for war, Scipio came to Syracuse, which was still quite unsettled after the great upheavals of the war. Some Greeks were trying to reclaim property which had been restored to them by the Senate from people of Italian stock, who were holding on to it with the same ferocity with which they had seized it during the hostilities. Feeling his first priority was to safeguard the integrity of the state, Scipio restored the property to the Syracusans by edict, and also by passing sentences on those who persisted in their unlawful possession. Such measures met with approval not only from the plaintiffs but also from all the communities of Sicily, who as a result assisted the war effort all the more assiduously. That same summer a serious war arose in Spain. It was the Illyrigitan Indibilis who fomented it, and the only reason he had for it was his admiration for Scipio, which led him to look down on other Roman commanders. Scipio, he felt, was the only leader the Romans had left, the rest having been killed by Hannibal. When the two Scipios had fallen, he reasoned they had had no one to send to Spain apart from him, and when the war in Italy gained momentum, they had called him back from there to face Hannibal. The Romans now had only nominal leaders in Spain, and apart from that, they had also withdrawn a seasoned army. They had left behind a completely volatile situation and a disorganized bunch of recruits, and there would never be another occasion like that for freeing Spain. To that day the Spaniards had served either the Carthaginians or the Romans, and not simply the one or the other in turn, but occasionally the two at once. The Carthaginians had been driven out by the Romans, and now the Romans could be driven out by the Spaniards, if they could form a united front. Thus Spain could be forever liberated from all foreign control, and could return to her native culture and observances. With little arguments, Indibilis spurred not just his own tribesmen to action, but the neighboring tribe of the Occitani, and other peoples, in his and their vicinity as well. So it was that within a few days 30,000 infantry and about 4,000 cavalry converged, following Indibilis' instructions, on the land of the Seditani. 2. The Roman commanders, Lucius Lentulus and Lucius Manlius Acidinus, fearful of an escalation of hostilities through initial negligence on their part, also united their armies. They then led their troops through the lands of the Occitani in a non-aggressive fashion, treating hostile soil as though it were pacified, and on reaching the position held by the enemy, they pitched their camp 3 miles away from theirs. They first sent envoys in an attempt which proved futile to persuade the Spaniards to lay down their arms. Then there was a lightning attack by the Spanish cavalry on a Roman foraging party. Horsemen were therefore sent out from a Roman outpost to assist the foragers, and this precipitated a cavalry engagement. But no significant advantage was gained by either side. At sunrise the next day the Spaniards were all deployed under arms, their line visible about a mile from the Roman camp. The Occitani were in the center, with the Illyrigetes holding the right wing, and some little-known Spanish tribes the left. Between the wings and the center they left gaps wide enough to enable them to send out cavalry at the appropriate moment. The Romans followed their usual pattern of deployment, but followed the enemy configuration in one respect. They, too, left paths open for the cavalry between the legions. Lentulus realized, however, that only one side would actually profit from its cavalry, and that was the one that first sent its horsemen into the gaps in the enemy line. They therefore ordered a military tribune, Servius Cornelius, to command his cavalry to charge at a gallop through the wide passages in the enemy formation. The infantry engagement did not begin well for the Romans, and the 12th Legion, positioned on the left wing facing the Ilergetes, was giving ground. Lentulus waited only long enough to bring up the 13th Legion from the reserves to the front to support the 12th, and then, with the fighting once more evenly matched in the quarter, he came to Lucius Manlius, who was in the front ranks shouting encouragement and bringing up reserve troops to points where they were needed. Lentulus informed Manlius that the left wing was now secured, and that he had dispatched Cornelius to encircle the enemy with a brisk cavalry charge. Barely had Lentulus uttered these words when the Roman cavalry charged into the midst of the enemy, throwing the infantry ranks into chaos and simultaneously closing the path the Spaniards intended using for their own cavalry charge. The Spanish horsemen therefore abandoned the cavalry fight and dismounted. When the Roman officers saw the confusion in the enemy ranks and observed their alarm, their panic, and their wavering standards, they urged and entreated their men to attack the demoralized force, and not allow the line to reform. The barbarians could not have held out against such a furious charge but for the chieftain, Indibilis, who, along with his dismounted cavalry, threw himself in the enemy's path before the front units. The fighting in the quarter remained ferocious for some time. The king was half dead, and still holding his ground. Then he was pinned to the ground by a javelin, and those fighting around him went down under a volley of missiles. And with that, the flight began in every sector. Casualties were increased because the horsemen had no room to mount their horses, and also because the Romans were putting heavy pressure on a demoralized foe, and there was no turning back until they seized his camp as well. 13,000 Spaniards fell that day, and roughly 1,800 prisoners were taken. The Roman and allied dead numbered slightly more than 200, most of them on the left wing. The Spaniards who had been driven from the camps, or who had escaped from the battle, first of all scattered through the countryside, and then returned to their various communities. 3. The survivors were then called to a council meeting by Mandonius. There they deplored their disastrous losses and berated the men who had fomented the war, and they voted to send envoys to hand over their weapons and negotiate terms of surrender. The envoys put the blame on Indibilis, whom they declared the prime mover of the war, and the other chieftains, most of whom had fallen in battle, and they offered to give up their weapons and surrender. The answer they received, however, was that acceptance of their surrender depended upon their surrendering alive Mandonius and other instigators of the war. Failing that, they were told, the Romans would bring their army into the land of the Ilergetes and the Occitani, and then, in turn, into of all the other tribes. Such was the reply to the envoys, and it was duly reported to the council. At the meeting, Mandonius and the other chieftains were then arrested and delivered up for punishment. Peace was thus restored to the peoples of Spain, who were obliged to pay double taxation that year, and provide a 6 months' supply of grain, along with cloaks and togas for the army. In addition, hostages were taken from some 30 tribes. And so unrest and rebellion in Spain had been whipped up and put down in just a few days, and with no serious upheaval, and now the threat of war focused entirely on Africa. Gaius Laelius had reached Hippo Regius under cover of night, and at dawn he had led out his soldiers in formation and supported by the crews of his ships to conduct raids on the local farmland. Everyone here was calmly going about his business, as in peacetime, and the damage inflicted was heavy. People brought the alarming news to Carthage, filling the city with sheer terror. A Roman fleet had arrived, they said, and with it the commander Scipio, and there had already been talk of Scipio's crossing to Sicily. The Carthaginians had no idea how many ships these people had seen, or the size of the force raiding the fields, and under the influence of fear they overestimated all reports. At first terror, the panic gripped their hearts, and then a gloomy foreboding. Such was the change in their circumstances they reflected. Recently they had themselves been victors, and had had an army before the walls of Rome. They had mown down so many enemy armies, and accepted the capitulation or voluntary surrender of all the peoples of Italy. Now the fortunes of war had turned, and they would see Africa being plundered and Carthage under siege, and to face these ordeals they had nothing like the strength the Romans had possessed. For the Romans had their proletariat, and they had Latium to give them an ever-burgeoning supply of young men to replace all their slaughtered armies. There was no military strength in their own urban or agrarian proletariat, they said, hence the mobilization of mercenary auxiliaries from the ranks of the Africans, a perfidious race that shifts loyalties with every prospect of gain. Then there were the kings. Sphax alienated them after his meeting with Scipio, and Manasseh, a deadly enemy, who had openly abandoned them. There was no hope, and no hope to be found anywhere. Mago was neither fomenting unrest in Gaul nor joining up with Hannibal, and Hannibal himself was weakening both in reputation and strength. 4. The Carthaginians had lapsed into these depressing reflections after the recent report, but fear for the present brought them back to consider how to deal with the perils they were now facing. It was decided that there should be a swift troop mobilization in the city and countryside, and that they would send men to hire mercenary auxiliaries from among the Africans. They would fortify the city, gather in grain, make ready arms and armor, and fit out ships and send them to Hippo to challenge the Roman fleet. They were involved in this when the message arrived that it was not Scipio, but Laelius, who had made the crossing, and with forces enough only for conducting raids on agricultural areas. Roman military activity was still mostly centered on Sicily. The Carthaginians were thus given a breathing space, and a start was made on sending embassies to Sphax and other chieftains with a view to establishing alliances. Men were also sent to Philip to promise him 200 talents of silver for an invasion of Sicily or Italy. There was also a delegation sent to the Carthaginian generals in Italy, instructing them to create all kinds of emergencies to detain Scipio. As for Mago, he was sent not only envoys, but 25 warships as well, plus 6,000 infantry, 800 cavalry, 7 elephants, and in addition a large sum of money to hire mercenaries. The thinking was that with such support Mago could move his army closer to the city of Rome and join up with Hannibal. Such was the preparation and planning taking place in Carthage. Meanwhile, Laelius was making off with huge quantities of plunder from farmlands that were unprotected and devoid of troops, and Massinissa, when he heard of the arrival of the Roman fleet, came to him with a few horsemen. Massinissa complained that Scipio's handling of operations was half-hearted. He had not yet brought any army over to Africa. Although, let's try that again. Massinissa complained that Scipio's handling of operations was half-hearted. He had not yet brought an army over to Africa, although the Carthaginians were demoralized, and Sphax was embroiled in wars with his neighbors. He added that he was convinced that Sphax, given the leeway to arrange affairs to his satisfaction, would show no loyalty whatsoever in his future dealings with the Romans. Laelius should encourage and urge Scipio not to hold back, and he himself, despite having been driven from his throne, would assist the Romans with both infantry and cavalry forces not to be scoffed at. Laelius should not himself wait around in Africa, either, he said, for he believed that a fleet had set sail from Carthage, and engaging that fleet in Scipio's absence would certainly not be a safe move. 5. Following this conversation, Laelius sent Massinissa off, and the following day set sail from Hippo with his plunder-laden ships. He returned to Sicily and delivered Massinissa's communique to Scipio. It was at about this time that the ships sent to Mago from Carthage put in at a point between the land of Ligurian Albingoni and Genua. Mago happened to have his fleet at anchor there at the time, and after hearing out the envoys, who relayed the orders for him to muster the largest armies he possibly could, he promptly held an assembly of Gauls and Ligurians, there being large numbers of both in the area. He told them that his mission was to champion their liberty. As they could see for themselves, he was not being sent reinforcements from home, but he added his strength and the size of his army for waging the war depended on them. He explained that there were 2 Roman armies in operation in the area, one in Gaul and the other in Etruria, and he knew for sure that Spurius Lucretius was going to join forces with Marcus Livius. For effective resistance to 2 Roman commanders, the 2 Roman armies, many thousands of men had to be put under arms. The Gauls expressed the greatest enthusiasm for this, but observed that they had 1 Roman camp within their territory, and a second almost within sight of them in nearby Etruria. If it became known that the Carthaginians were receiving assistance from the Gauls, they would instantly have hostile armies invading their land from both directions. Mago should therefore request of the Gauls only such assistance as could be given covertly. The Ligurians were in a different situation, they said, with Roman camps a long way off from their farmland and cities. They could make their decisions freely, and it was only right that they should put their younger men under arms and take their fair share of the war. The Ligurians did not demur, requesting only a 2-month period for recruiting troops. Meanwhile, Mago proceeded to hire Gallic mercenary soldiers by sending agents covertly through their territory, and he was also sent supplies of all kinds by the Gallic tribes in secret consignments. Marcus Livius brought his army of slave volunteers from Etruria into Gaul. He joined up with Lucretius and prepared to face Mago, should he move out of Liguria and come closer to the city. If the Carthaginians remained inactive in that remote corner of the Alps, however, Livius would remain in position close to Ariminum in order to protect Italy. Six. After Gaius Laelius returned from Africa, Scipio was aroused by Massinissa's words of encouragement. In addition, his men were fired with a desire to cross to Africa as soon as possible when they saw plunder from enemy territory being unloaded from an entire fleet. However, this major scheme was put on hold by a lesser one, namely the recovery of the city of Locri, which during the Italian defections had also gone over to the Carthaginians. A gleam of hope of attaining this goal arose from a very minor incident. Marauding rather than regular warfare was now the order of the day in Bruttium. The Numidians had started this, and the Brutii, following suit, as much before it suited their make-up as because of their alliance with Carthage. Finally, even the Roman soldiery became infected with the disease, and within the limits set by the officers, began to take pleasure in looting and making raids on enemy farms. Now, a number of Lucrians who had come out of their city were surrounded by the Romans and taken off to Rhegium. Amongst prisoners taken were a number of tradesmen who had been regularly hired by the Carthaginians for work in the citadel of Leucri. The tradesmen were recognized by some prominent Lucrian citizens, who were at the time in exile at Rhegium, having been expelled by the opposing faction that had delivered Leucri to Hannibal. These men put to them questions usually asked by people who had been long absent from home, and the tradesmen told them what was going on in Leucri, and also gave them hope that they would deliver the citadel to them if they were ransomed and sent back. For they said they lived in the town, and the Carthaginians trusted them in every respect. The exiles, suffering severe homesickness, and also feeling a burning desire for vengeance on their enemies, promptly redeemed the men and sent them back home. First, however, they came to an agreement with the tradesmen on a program for bringing off the coup. And on the signals, these were to look for the distance from the citadel. They went off to Syracuse to see Scipio, with whom they were also a number of the Locrian exiles, and recounted what the prisoners had undertaken to do. This gave the consul some hope of its success, and so the military tribunes, Marcus Sergius and Publius Matinus, were sent back with the exiles, under orders to take 3,000 soldiers from Rhegium to Locri. The propraetor, Quintus Plaminius, was also given written orders to take an active part in the operation. The force set off from Rhegium, carrying ladders specially constructed to the height of the citadel, and around the middle of the night, from the agreed location, they gave the signal to the 5th column in the citadel. The men were prepared and on the alert, and they themselves lowered ladders that were custom-made for the job. They took in the Romans, who scaled the wall at several points at once, and before any cry could go up, an attack was launched on the Carthaginian sentries, who, naturally fearing no such occurrence, had fallen asleep. The groans of the dying men were the first thing to be heard. Then came the sudden uproar and confusion as men were awakened from their sleep without knowing what had caused the alarm. But eventually things came clearer as they began to rouse each other. At last they were all issuing calls to arms, shouting that the enemy was in the citadel and the sentries were being killed. The Romans, nowhere near as numerous as their enemy, would have been overwhelmed but for a cry raised by the men outside the citadel, for this rendered unclear the source of the alarm, and the confusion and darkness only served to intensify every groundless fear. As a result, the Carthaginians were terror-stricken. They assumed the citadel to be now full of the enemy, and they abandoned the fight and sought refuge in the other citadel. for there are two a short distance from each other. The townspeople were then left holding their town, which was set between the two sides as the victor's prize, and every day light skirmishes would be started from the two citadels. Quintus Flaminius was in charge of the Roman force, Hamilcar of the Carthaginian. They each augmented their troops by summoning reinforcements from the surrounding areas. Finally, Hannibal himself was en route for the town. The Romans could not have held out against him had not the sentiments of most Lucrians, embittered by Carthaginian arrogance and rapacity, felt more sympathy for the Roman cause. 7. When he was brought the news that the situation in Locre was becoming more dangerous, and that Hannibal himself was on his way, Scipio did not want the force there also to be put at risk, for its withdrawal from the town would not be easy. He therefore left his brother Lucius Scipio in command of the garrison at Messana, and as soon as the tide turned in the straits, set off from there with 10 ships, the flow now in his favor. Hannibal, meanwhile, sent a message from the river Bolotus, not far from the city of Locre, ordering his men to engage the Romans and Lucrians with maximum force at daybreak. In the meantime, he explained, while everyone's attention was focused on that confrontation, he would himself make an attack on the unsuspecting city from the rear. At dawn, Hannibal found the battle already underway. He was unwilling to confine himself to the citadel. With his numbers, he would choke such a restricted area, and he had not brought ladders for scaling the walls. He therefore piled up the baggage and presented his army in battle order close to the walls, He therefore piled up the baggage and presented his army in battle order close to the walls, hoping to intimidate the enemy. Then, as ladders and other materials needed for an assault were being prepared, he began to ride around the city with his Numidian cavalry to see just where he should launch his attack. As he went up to the wall, the man who happened to have been standing next to him was struck with a projectile from a scorpion. The incident, which had exposed him to great danger, unnerved Hannibal. He ordered the retreat to be sounded, and established a fortified camp out of missile range. The Roman fleet arrived in Locre from Messana, when much of the day still remained. The men were all put ashore, and they entered the city before sunset. The next day, the Carthaginians started the fighting from their citadel, and Hannibal, who had by now finished preparing the ladders and everything else for the assault, began to move up to the walls. Suddenly, the last thing he feared, the gate opened, and Romans came charging out at him. The attack of the Romans took the Carthaginians by surprise, and left some 200 dead. And when Hannibal realized that the consul was present, he brought the others back to camp. He sent word to the men in the citadel that they should look out for themselves, and then struck camp during the night and left. The men in the citadel set fire to the buildings they occupied, hoping that the resulting confusion would slow down the enemy, and then, moving at the pace of fleeing men, caught up with the column of their comrades before nightfall. 8. When he saw that the citadel had been abandoned by the enemy, and that their camp was empty, Scipio called the citizens of Locre to an assembly and severely reprimanded them for their defection. He executed the ringleaders and made their property over to the principal members of the faction that had opposed them, in recognition of these people's exceptional loyalty to Rome. He said that he was not officially in a position to give anything to or take anything from the Lucrians. They should send representatives to Rome and accept whatever fate the Senate saw fit to impose on them. Of one thing he was sure, he said. Despite their shoddy treatment of the Roman people, they would be better off facing the wrath of Rome than having the friendship of Carthage. Scipio then left his legate, Flaminius, to defend the city with the force that had taken the citadel, while he himself crossed to Messana with the troops with which he had come. After they abandoned the Roman cause, the Locrians had been treated by the Carthaginians in such a high-handed and ruthless manner that they After they abandoned the Roman cause, the Locrians had been treated by the Carthaginians in such a high-handed and ruthless manner that they found it possible to endure ordinary iniquities, not only with sang-froid, but almost with cheerfulness. But in fact, in terms of unscrupulous and rapacious conduct, Flaminius so outdid the garrison commander Hamilcar, and the Roman occupying force so outdid the Carthaginians that it seemed like a contest in villainy, not arms. Of all the things that make the weak hate the strength of the powerful, there was not one that was not inflicted on the townspeople by the commander or his men. Unspeakable abuse was inflicted on the men themselves, on their children, and on their wives. Soon the greed of the Romans did not shrink from the desecration even of the sacred, and it was not simply a matter of the violation of ordinary temples. Even the treasures of Proserpina suffered this fate, though they had remained inviolate throughout history, apart from the time when they were said to have been looted by Pyrrhus, who paid a heavy price in atonement for the sacrilege, and returned his spoils. On that occasion the ships of the king were shattered in a wreck, and they succeeded in bringing nothing to land undamaged, apart from the holy money of the goddess that they were transporting. It was the same on this occasion, even if the disaster was of a different kind. That same money brought madness on all the men tainted with that violation of the temple, turning officer against officer and soldier against soldier with furious acrimony. 9. Flaminius had overall command, and some of the troops, those that he had himself brought from Rhegium, were serving directly under him, while others were under the tribunes. A soldier of Flaminius had filched a silver cup from the home of one of the townspeople, and as he fled, pursued by the owners, he happened to run into the military tribunes, Sergius and Matienus. The man then had the cup removed from him at the order of the tribunes. This led to quarreling and shouting, and finally a fight broke out between Flaminius's men and those of the tribunes. The numbers involved and the disorder growing as people happened to come on the scene to help one side or the other. Flaminius's men took a beating, and they came running to Flaminius's, pointing to their bloody wounds, and they added cries of indignation and told him of insults that had been directed at him during the brawl. Flaminius was furious. He charged from the house, had the tribunes summoned, and gave orders for them to be stripped of their clothes and for whips to be made ready. Some time passed while the tribunes were being stripped, and kept struggling and begging the men present to help, and suddenly their soldiers, flushed with their recent victory, came running from all directions, just as if they had been summoned to arms against the enemy. When they saw the injuries the tribunes had already suffered from the lash, they were instantly fired with a much more uncontrollable fury. With no consideration for the man's authority or even for civilized behavior, they first gave the lictors a shameful beating, and then turned their attack on the legate. They fenced him off and isolated him from his men, viciously mauled him, and left him almost dead, with his nose and ears cut off. The incident was reported to Scipio in Messana, and a few days later he sailed to Locri in a hexeris. After hearing the cases presented by Plaminius and the tribunes, he exonerated Plaminius of any culpability and left him in place, still in command. The tribunes he found guilty, and he clapped them in irons to be sent to the Senate in Rome. He then returned to Messana, and from there to Syracuse. Plaminius was in an uncontrollable rage. He felt that the wrong he had suffered had been negligently dealt with and underestimated by Scipio, and that the only person capable of assessing the penalty was the man who had been on the receiving end of the outrage. He had the tribunes hold before him, and after mutilating them with every torture that can be inflicted on a human body, put them to death. Then, not satisfied with punishing them while they were alive, he threw them out unburied. He was just as brutal with the most prominent burghers of Locri, who he heard had gone to Publius Scipio to protest against the wrongs he had done them. The earlier instances of shameful abuse that he had inflicted on the allies, from covetousness and greed, he now multiplied from anger, and brought opprobrium and hatred not merely on himself, but on his commanding officer as well. The date for the elections was now approaching when a letter from the consul Publius Licinius was brought to Rome. Licinius reported that he and his army were afflicted by a serious disease, and that had not the malady struck the enemy with the same or even greater virulence, holding out against them would have been impossible. Thus, since he could not himself come for the elections, he would, if the senators concurred, appoint Quintus Caecilius Metellus dictator for the purpose of holding them. The mobilization of Quintus Caecilius' army was in the interest of the state, he added, since at that moment it was serving no purpose. Hannibal had already taken his men back to winter quarters, and so virulent was the plague that had struck Metellus' own camp that, unless the army were swiftly disbanded, it looked as though not a single man would survive. The consul was given leave to take whatever measures he thought the public interest and his own sense of duty called for. At that time there was a sudden onset of religious fervor amongst the citizens after an oracle was discovered in the Sibylline books, which had been At that time there was a sudden onset of religious fervor amongst the citizens after an oracle was discovered in the Sibylline books, which had been consulted because of an increase in the number of showers of stones that year. The oracle declared that whensoever a foreign foe should bring war upon the land of Italy, he could be driven from Italy and vanquished, if the Idaean mother were brought to Rome from Pessinus. The oracle, which had been discovered by the decemvirs, made all the greater an impression on the senators, because of the report of the envoys who had taken the gift to Delphi. The envoys declared that everything had been favorable during their sacrifice to Pythian Apollo, and that there had been an oracular response, promising the Roman people a victory, one far greater than the whose spoils had provided the gifts they were bearing. The senators felt these hopes were confirmed by Publius Scipio's request for Africa as his province, which suggested that he had some presentiment of the war's conclusion. Wishing therefore to accelerate the victory that was announcing itself through prophecies, omens, and oracles, they now proceeded to discuss and consider the logistics of transporting the goddess over to Rome. 11. The Roman people had as yet no states in Asia allied to them. Nevertheless, people remembered that Asclepius had at one time been brought from Greece to check an epidemic, when there was still no formal alliance with that country, whereas now friendly relations had already been established with King Attalus for the conduct of joint hostilities against Philip. Attalus would, they thought, do all that he could to help the Roman people. They decided to send to the king a delegation consisting of Marcus Valerius Lavinus, consul on 2 occasions, and a former commander in Greece, a former praetor, Marcus Caecilius Metellus, and ex-aedile, Servius Sulpicius Galba, and 2 ex-quaestors, Gnaeus Tremellius Flaccus, and Marcus Valerius Falto. To these men they officially assigned 5 quinqueremes, so they could maintain the dignity of the Roman people when they approached those lands that needed to be impressed with the prestige of the Roman name. On their way to Asia, the delegates went up to Delphi. There they immediately approached the oracle with the question of what prospects it foresaw for them, and the Roman people of accomplishing the mission on which they had been sent from home. The response, they say, was that they would gain their end through the help of King Attalus, and that after transporting the goddess to Rome, they must ensure that the person giving the goddess a warm welcome should be the best man in Rome. The delegates then came to the king in Pergamum. After giving them a friendly reception, Attalus accompanied them to Pessinus in Phrygia. But in their after giving them a friendly reception, Attalus accompanied After giving them a friendly reception, Attalus accompanied them to Pessinus in Phrygia, put in their hands the stone that the local people said was the mother of the gods, and told them to take it away to Rome. Marcus Valerius Falto was sent ahead by the delegates with the message that the goddess was in transit, and that the Romans had to seek out the best man in their city-state to welcome her with the appropriate forms of hospitality. Quintus Caecilius Metellus was appointed dictator for overseeing the elections by the consul, who was in Bruttium, and his army was disbanded. Lucius Veturius Philo was appointed master of horse. The elections were then held by the dictator, and the consuls elected were Marcus Cornelius Cethegus and Publius Sempronius Tuditanus, and the latter in absentia, as he was on assignment in Greece. The praetors elected after that were Tiberius Claudius Nero, Marcus Marcius Rala, Lucius Scribonius Libo, and Marcus Pomponius Matho. The elections over the dictator resigned his position. There were 3 repetitions of the Roman games, and 7 of the plebeian. The curule aediles were Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus and Lucius Cornelius Lentulus. Lucius had Spain as his province, and, elected in his absence, he was also absent from Rome during his tenure of the post. Tiberius Claudius, Asellus, and Marcus Junius Pennus were the plebeian aediles. That year Marcus Marcellus dedicated the temple of Veritas at the Porto Capena, 16 years after it had been promised in a vow at Clastidium in Gaul by Marcellus' father during the first consulship. Also during that year, the flamen of Mars, Marcus Aemilius Regulus, died. (11) 12. The Greek situation had received no attention during the past 2 years. As a result, Philip forced the Aetolians, who had been abandoned by the Romans, the one power on which they relied for assistance, to sue for peace, and accept it on his terms. Had he not made every effort to accomplish this quickly, the proconsul, Publius Sempronius, might have surprised him while he was still at war with the Aetolians, for Sempronius had been sent to succeed Sulpicius in his command with 10,000 infantry, 1,000 cavalry, and 35 warships, and he represented a not inconsiderable force for helping the allies. With the peace barely concluded, news reached the king that the Romans had reached Dyrrhachium, and that the Partheni and other tribes in the area had been roused to hopes of revolutionary change, and that Damalum was under attack. The Romans had actually made a diversion into that area. They had been sent to aid the Aetolians, but furious with the Aetolians because they had concluded a peace with the king, without Roman authority, and in contravention of their treaty, they had abandoned their mission. When he heard about this, Philip feared that greater unrest might arise among the neighboring tribes and peoples, and he made swiftly for Apollonia with forced marches. It was to Apollonia that Sempronius had withdrawn. Having sent his legate, Laetorius, into Aetolio with a portion of his troops and 25 ships to see how matters stood there, and to upset the peace if he could, Philip plundered the agricultural land of Apollonia, and bringing his troops up to the city, gave the Romans the opportunity to do battle. But he saw that they made no move beyond manning the walls, and he had insufficient confidence in his forces for an assault on the city. Besides, he wanted to make a peace with the Romans if he could, as he had with the Aetolians, or, failing that, at least negotiate a truce. So he avoided provoking them with fresh hostilities, and withdrew into his kingdom. The people of Epirus were now growing tired of the prolonged hostilities, and at about this time, having first sounded the feelings of the Romans, they sent a delegation to Philip to broach the subject of a general peace. They were certain this could be arranged. They assured Philip, if he came to a meeting with Publius Sempronius, the Roman commander, their request that Philip cross to Epirus was readily granted, since the king himself felt no aversion to peace. At Phoenice, a city in Epirus, the king first held talks with Europus, later met with Publius Sempronius. Present at the meeting were Amenander, king of the Athemanians, and other magistrates of the Epirots and Acarnanians. The praetor Philip opened the proceedings. He made a plea for an armistice simultaneously to the king and the Roman commander, and asked them to grant that, as a favor to the people of Epirus, the conditions for peace that Publius Sempronius laid down were that of Partheni, Demalum, Bargulum, and Eugenium should be under Roman authority, and that if the king sent ambassadors to Rome and gained the Senate's approval, Atintania should be ceded to Macedon. The peace was then concluded on these terms: Prusias, king of Bithynia and Achaeans, the Boeotians, the Thessalians, the Acarnanians, and the Epirites were included in the treaty by the king and the people of Ilium. King Attalus, Pleuratus, Nabis, tyrant of Sparta, and Elians, the Messenians, and the Athenians by the Romans. The terms were put in writing, and a seal affixed to the document, and a 2-month truce was fixed to allow envoys to be sent to Rome, so that the people might sanction the peace on these conditions. The tribes did sanction it, and unanimously, because with the war now focused on Africa, they wanted, for the time being, to be released from all other wars. The peace concluded, Publius Sempronius left for Rome to take up the consulship. 13. In the consulship of Marcus Cornelius and Publius Sempronius, and the 15th year of the Punic War, Cornelius was assigned Etruria as his province along with its old army, while Sempronius was assigned Bruttium and given orders to muster new legions. As for the praetors, the urban jurisdiction came to Marcus Marcius, the foreigners' jurisdiction plus Gaul to Lucius Scribonius Libo, Sicily to Marcus Pomponius Matho, and Sardinia to Tiberius Claudius Nero. Publius Scipio had his imperium extended for a year, and retained command of his army and fleet. The same prerogative was extended to Publius Licinius, to allow him to hold Bruttium with 2 legions, for as long as the consul felt it was in the public interest for him to stay on the province with imperium. Marcus Livius and Spurius Lucretius also saw their imperium extended, each commanding 2 legions, those which they had used for the defense of Gaul amongst Mago. So too did Gnaeus Octavius, who was to pass Sardinia and his legion on to Tiberius Claudius, and himself patrol the coastline within bounds set by the Senate, with 40 ships. In Sicily, the praetor Marcus Pomponius was assigned the 2 legions of the army that had fought at Cannae. Titus Quinctius and Gnaeus Hostilius Tubulus were to have charge of Tarentum and Capua, respectively, with proprietarian authority, as they had the year before, and with the old army in both cases. As regards the Spanish command, the judgment of the people was sought on the 2 men they wished sent as proconsuls to the sphere of authority. The tribes unanimously called for the same 2 men to hold these areas of responsibility as proconsuls, as had held them the year before, namely Lucius Cornelius Lentulus and Lucius Manlius Acidinus. The consuls proceeded to hold a troop levy, which was aimed at raising fresh legions to serve in Bruttium, and also, in accordance with their orders from the Senate, supplementary troops for the other armies. Africa had not yet been publicly declared a formal sphere of responsibilities, for the senators were keeping the matter a secret, I believe to prevent the Carthaginians coming to hear of it too soon. Even so, the hopes of the citizen body had been raised of a campaign in Africa that year, and of an imminent end to the Punic War. This had filled people's minds with superstition, making them predisposed both to report and to accept paranormal phenomena. Accounts of such phenomena, therefore, began to circulate in greater numbers. 2 suns had been sighted, it was said, and there had been moments of daylight during the night. And at Setia, a meteor was said to have been seen traveling from east to west. It was reported that at Terracina a gate had been struck by lightning, and that at Anagenia a gate as well as many points on the city wall had been struck. In the temple of Juno, Sospita, at Lanuvium, there was a crash, accompanied by a horrific roar. A single day of prayer was held to expiate these divine manifestations, and the 9-day rite was also performed because of a shower of stones. In addition to this, there was also discussion of the welcome to be given to the Idaean mother. One of the delegates, Marcus Valerius, had come ahead of the others with the news that she would soon be in Italy, and a fresh report had also come indicating that she was already in Terracina. There was now a question of no small importance exercising the Senate, who was the best man in the community, and everyone would have preferred to win an honest victory in that particular competition than to have any commands or public offices conferred upon him, whether by vote of the Senate or the people. The senators adjudged Publius Scipio, son of the Gnaeus Scipio, who had fallen in Spain, and a young man who had not yet held the quaestorship, to be the best of the good men in the entire community. The qualities in the men that led them to such a decision I would have been happy to pass down to posterity, had such an account been passed down to me by writers living close to the time of the event. But I shall not introduce my own views reached through conjecture about a subject now long buried in the past. Publius Cornelius was instructed to proceed to Ostia with all the married ladies to meet the goddess. There he was to welcome her from the ship, bring her to land, and hand her to the married ladies to be carried to the city. After the ship reached the mouth of the river Tiber, Scipio, following his instructions, put to sea and, receiving the goddess from her priest, brought her to shore. The leading married women of the community received her. Amongst these was one whose name is preeminent, Claudia Quinta, whose dubious reputation in earlier days, it is said, added greater lustre to the purity for which she was known to posterity, thanks to her solemn duty on this occasion. The ladies kept passing the goddess to each other from hand to hand on their journey, as the entire community poured forth to meet them. And there were censers placed before the doors along the route where she was born. As incense burned, the people prayed that she should enter the city of Rome with grace and favor. They carried the goddess to the temple of Victory on the Palatine. This was on the 12th of April, which was thereafter a holy day. The people crowded the Palatine, bearing gifts for the goddess, and there was a lectisternium, 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 and games that were called the Megalesia. 15. Discussions in the Senate now focused on bringing up to strength the legions in the areas of official responsibility, and a suggestion was made by certain members that a state of affairs that had somehow been tolerated in difficult times should no longer be endured, now that, thanks to heaven's blessings, the threat had been removed. At this the senators' ears pricked up. The members went on to say that the 12 Latin colonies, which had refused to provide soldiers in the consulship of Quintus Fabius and Quintus Fulvius, had now enjoyed almost 5 years of exemption from military service, regarding it almost as an honor or benefit conferred on them. Meanwhile, they added, good and loyal allies had, in return for their faithful service to the Roman people, been drained by levies conducted every year without interruption during that period. The mention of this did not simply remind the senators of an issue now well nigh forgotten, but actually roused them to anger. As a result, they would permit the consuls to raise no item of business before this, and they passed a decree instructing them to call to Rome the magistrates and 10 leading citizens from each of the communities in question, which were Nepete, Sutrium, Ardea, Callis, Alba, Carcioli, Sora, Suessa, Setia, Cersae, Narnia, and Inter Amna. The consuls were to demand from each other of these colonies twice the largest total of infantrymen that it had supplied to the Roman people ever since the appearance of the enemy in Italy, and also requisition 120 cavalrymen from each of them. Any that was unable to reach the required number of cavalrymen should be allowed to provide infantrymen on the basis of 3 infantrymen per cavalryman. Foot and cavalry soldiers selected should be the wealthiest members of their community, and they were to be sent anywhere that supplementary forces were needed outside Italy. It was also resolved that a refusal to comply would lead to the detention of the magistrates and representatives of that colony, and that any request for a senatorial hearing be refused until they had fulfilled their obligations. The Senate further decided that the colonies in question should have a tax imposed on them at the rate of 1 as per 1,000, to be charged annually. The tax assessment in these colonies would be based on the list established by the Roman censors, for it was the Senate's will that the list conform that used for the Roman people and be brought to Rome by the censors of the colonies, who would be under oath before they left office. Following this decree of the Senate, the consuls called to Rome the magistrates and most prominent citizens of the colonies involved that made the demand for the soldiers and the tax. This led to the colonists shouting each other down in their objections and protest. Raising such a force of soldiers was impossible, they said, and they would scarcely manage if the requirement were the original number in the register. They begged and pleaded to be allowed to appear in the Senate and make their appeal, saying that they had done nothing to deserve ruin. But even if they had to face ruin, they added, neither their misdeed nor the anger of the Roman people could make them contribute more men than they had. The consuls stood firm, ordering the delegates to remain in Rome and the magistrates to go home to raise the troops, unless the requisitionate. The consuls stood firm, ordering the delegates to remain in Rome and the magistrates to go home to raise the troops, unless the requisite complement of fighting men were brought to Rome. They were told no one would grant them a senatorial hearing. With that, all hope of appearing before the Senate and making an appeal now removed. A troop levy was conducted in the 12 colonies, concerned, and thanks to the increase in younger men as a result of the long exemption, it was completed without difficulty. 16. Another matter that had been neglected and left in silence for almost as long as was also brought up by Marcus Valerius Laevinus. He stated that it was only fair that the individuals concerned should finally be repaid and financial contributions they had made, when he and Marcus Claudius were consuls. No one should be surprised that he was taking a particular interest in the financial obligations incurred by the state, he said. A consul of the year in which the contributions were made, and some personal involvement, and besides, it was he who had suggested such a contribution at a time when the public purse was empty and the people unable to afford the war tax. The senators were pleased to be reminded of this. They instructed the consuls to put the matter to the House, and then decreed that the money should be repaid in 3 installments. The first to be disbursed immediately by the consuls of the current year, the 2 others by the consuls 2 and 4 years after that. One issue then put all other concerns in abeyance. To that date, nothing was known of the terrible fate that had overtaken the Locrians, but now, with the arrival of the Locrian delegation, word of it spread, and what roused public animosity was not so much Flaminius's criminal activities as Scipio's partiality or his negligence in his case. There were 10 Locrian delegates, shabbily dressed in soiled clothing, and they approached the consuls as they sat in the comitium. A Greek fashion, they held before them olive branches symbolizing their suppliant status, and with tearful cries they flung themselves to the ground before the tribunal. When the consuls asked them to explain themselves, they said that they were Locrians, and that at the hands of the legate Quintus Flaminius and the Roman soldiers they had suffered what the Roman people would not even want the Carthaginians to suffer. They were begging the senators to grant them leave to appear before them, they explained, and to tell the sad tale of their tribulations. 17. They were granted an audience with the Senate, and the eldest of the Locrians gave the following address. I am aware, members of the Senate, that the most important factor in how our grievances are to be assessed by you is a full understanding on your part both of how Locri was betrayed to Hannibal, and how Hannibal's garrison was then expelled and the town restored to your authority. For if culpability for our defection cannot be attributed to public policy, and if it becomes clear that our return to your control arose not only with our support, but also thanks to our own efforts and valor, then you would be all the more indignant at seeing such undeserved and atrocious injuries inflicted on good and faithful allies by your legate and soldiers. My own opinion, however, is that an explanation of both our defections should be held over for another time, and that for 2 reasons. In the first place, I feel that the matter should be discussed in the presence of Publius Scipio, who took back Locri, and who is witness to all that we have done, good and bad. Secondly, no matter what our conduct has been, we did not deserve to suffer what we have suffered. We cannot hide the fact, members of the Senate, that when we had a Carthaginian garrison in our citadel, we suffered many foul indignities at the hands of the garrison commander Hamilcar and his Numidians and Africans. But what are they when they are compared with what we are suffering today? Please listen with indulgence, senators, to what I must reluctantly say. All of humanity is now on tenterhooks, waiting to see whether it is to be you or the Carthaginians who will be rulers of the world. If Roman and Carthaginian domination must be judged on the basis of what we Lucretians suffered from the Carthaginians, or what we are suffering at this very time from your occupying troops, then there is no one who would not prefer to have them rather than you as their masters. But, that said, consider the Locrians' attitude towards you. When we had injuries much less serious inflicted on us by the Carthaginians, we looked to our commander for protection. Now that we are enduring, at the hands of your garrison, treatment worse than an enemy would mete out, we have brought our complaints to you, and to you alone. Either you will show some concern for our wretched plight, members of the Senate, or there remains nothing that we can ask even of the immortal gods in our prayers. The legate, Quintus Flaminius, was sent with a body of troops to recover Lucre from the Carthaginians, and he was then left in the town with that same force. Senators, for our own extreme suffering gives me the courage to speak openly. In that legate of yours there is nothing of a human being beyond his shape and appearance. There is nothing of the Roman citizen beyond his demeanor, his clothing, and the tones of the Latin language. He is a scourge, a frightful monster, of the sort that the myths tell us used to plague the strait dividing us from Sicily, in order to bring destruction on mariners. Now, were he satisfied with being the only one to inflict his criminal, libidinous, and rapacious treatment on your allies, then we might resign ourselves and satisfy this one yawning maw. As it is, he has made all your centurions and all your soldiers a Flaminius. That is how far he has wanted the debauchery and immorality spread around. They are all given to robbery, pillage, assault, wounding, murder. They rape married women, girls, and freeborn boys torn from their parents' arms. Every day our city suffers capture. Every day it is pillaged. Day and night every corner of it rings with the wailing of women and boys being violated and carried off. Anyone aware of our situation would be amazed at how we are managing to put up with it, or how the perpetrators have not yet grown tired of their gross abuses. I cannot give, and it is not worth your while to hear, every detail of our past sufferings, but let me give you a general summary. I tell you that there is no home in Locre, no single individual that has escaped abuse. I tell you that there is no crime, no lust, no greed, in any shape or form that has not been inflicted on anyone on whom it could be inflicted. It is virtually impossible to calculate which is the more horrible a situation in which a community can find itself, when an enemy has taken the city in war, or when a murderous tyrant has crushed it with armed force. Everything that captured cities endure we have endured. And are enduring now more than ever, members of the Senate. All the crimes that the most ruthless and despotic tyrants inflict on the citizens they have crushed. All these Flaminius has inflicted on us, on our children, and on our wives. 18. There is one specific item about which our feelings for religion will lie deep in our hearts, oblige us to make a specific complaint. Members of the Senate, we should like you to hear this, and if you agree, free your state from a religious obligation, for we have observed the regard with which you not only worship your own deities, but also accept those from outside. There is in our city a shrine of Proserpina, and I believe some report of the holiness of this temple reached you during the war with Phaedrus, while he was sailing by Locre with his fleet on his way back from Sicily. Phaedrus committed a number of atrocities against our community because of our loyalty to you. In particular, he looted the treasury of Proserpina, which had, until that day, remained untouched. After setting the money aboard his ships, he himself set off on an overland journey. And what happened then, members of the Senate? The next day his fleet was severely damaged by a terrible storm, and all the ships carrying the sacred money were driven aground on the shores. And the proud king, finally learning from his enormous loss that the gods do exist, gave orders for all the money to be gathered together and replaced in the treasury of Proserpina. Even so, no good ever came to him after that. Driven out of Italy, he made a foolish attack on Argos by night, and met an inglorious and dishonorable end. Your legate and your military tribunes had been informed of this incident, and of 1,000 others, and they are not being told stories fabricated to increase their religious awe, but things that we and our ancestors knew for a fact about the clear intervention of the goddess's power. But they still dared to lay their impious hands on those inviolable treasures of hers, and with that abominable plunder to defile themselves, their homes, and your soldiers, too. Members of the Senate, please, for your own sakes, and for your honor's sake, do not use these men on any of your operations, either in Italy or Africa, before you have atoned for their crime. For they may pay for the sin they have committed not only by shedding their own blood, but also by bringing ruin to their state. In fact, even now, senators, the anger of the goddess has not been slow in visiting your officers or your men. On occasion they have clashed in armed combat, Flaminius the leader on the one side, and the 2 military tribunes on the other. They fought with the sword, no more ferociously with the Carthaginians than they did amongst themselves. And but for the intervention of Scipio, who came at our request, they might well, in their rage, have given Hannibal the chance of recovering Locri. But I suppose you may think the fury of the god is focused on the soldiers tainted by the sacrilege, and that there has been no sign of the goddess's divine power in punishment being inflicted on the leaders themselves. Quite the reverse. That is, where she is most at work. The tribunes were flogged by the legate. Then the legate was trapped and cut off from his men by the tribunes. In addition to receiving lacerations to his entire body, he had his nose and ears cut off, and was left practically dead. Then, when the legate had recovered from his wounds, he had the military tribunes clapped in irons, and put them to death after flogging them and inflicting on them every form of torture normally reserved for slaves, and after that would not allow the burial of their dead bodies. Such is the punishment the goddess metes out to the looters of her temple, and she is not going to stop plaguing those men with all manner of frenzy until her holy money has been restored to her treasury. At one time, our ancestors were involved in a serious war with Croton, and because the temple is situated outside the city, they wanted to bring that money into town. At night, a voice was heard coming from the shrine, telling them to keep their hands off. This was the goddess's temple, and she would defend it. They were struck with religious awe, which deterred them from removing the money, and they then tried to surround the temple with a wall. The defensive structure had been brought up to a certain height when it suddenly collapsed. On this occasion, too, as then, and on numerous other occasions, the goddess has protected her own home, her own temple, or has exacted heavy penalties from their violators. But as for the wrongs done to us, no one can avenge them but you, members of the Senate, nor would we want it otherwise. It is to you and your honor that we turn for help as suppliants. It is all the same to us whether you leave Lucre under the command of that legate and that garrison, or whether you hand it over for punishment to an angry Hannibal and the Carthaginians. We are not asking you to believe what we say right away when the man is absent and has not been given a hearing. Let him come here. Let him hear the charges in person, and in person rebuke them. If he has failed to commit any criminal act that man can inflict on human beings, then we have no objection to suffering over again, if we can, all those torments, and to his being exonerated of any crime against gods and men. 19. After this address by the Locrian delegates, Quintus Fabius asked them if they had brought these complaints to Publius Scipio. They answered that a delegation had been sent to him, but that he was busy with preparations for the war, and had either already crossed to Africa, or would be doing so in a few days. They added that they had experience of the favoritism shown to the legate by the commander. After hearing the dispute between Flaminius and the tribunes, Scipio had put the tribunes in irons and left the legate, who was equally guilty, or even more guilty than they, in the position of power as he was holding. The delegates were told to leave the temple, and then not only Flaminius but Scipio too received a scathing reprimand in the speeches of the senior members. Severest of all was Quintus Fabius, who claimed that Scipio was naturally predisposed to destroy the discipline of soldiers. Thus it was that in Spain he had almost lost more through a mutiny of his soldiers than he had through the war. Like a foreign potentate, he was in turn over-tolerant with the indiscipline of his men and ruthless with them. Fabius then followed up his address with an equally harsh motion, which went as follows: that the Senate resolve that the legate Flaminius be brought to Rome in shackles, that he plead his case in his chains, and if the complaints of the Locrians prove true, that he be executed in prison, and his property be appropriated by the state. That inasmuch as Publius Scipio had left his assigned command without senatorial authorization, he be recalled, and that discussions be opened with the tribunes of the plebs about bringing before the people a proposal to revoke his imperium. That the Senate give a response to the Locrians in their presence, stating that the injustices which they complained had been inflicted on them had the approval of neither the Senate nor the people. The Locrians must be declared worthy men, and allies and friends of Rome, and restitution must be made of their children, wives, and all else that had been taken from them. That a search be made for all the money removed from the treasury of Proserpina, and that money be replaced in her treasury to twice the amount, and there should be a sacrifice of atonement in view of the fact that sacred treasures had been removed, opened, and violated. The question of the requisite expiatory ceremonies, the gods for whom they are to be held, and the animals to be sacrificed, should be referred to the College of Pontiffs. That the soldiers in Locre all be transported to Sicily, and 4 cohorts of Latin allies be brought in to garrison Locre. Passions were inflamed in support of Scipio and against him, and as a result, not all opinions could be gathered that day. A Apart from the question of Flaminius' misconduct and the afflictions of the Locrians, there were even criticisms of the commander's personal appearance, not simply unlike a Roman, but unlike a soldier. He would saunter around the gymnasium in a Greek cloak and sandals, it was said, and spend his time on books and exercising, and his entire staff enjoyed as much idleness and easy living, tasting the delights of Syracuse. Carthage and Hannibal were gone from Scipio's mind, they said, and the whole army, ruined through lack of discipline, like the one in Socro in Spain earlier and that in Locre now, was an object of fear more to the allies than to the enemy. 20. Some of these criticisms were valid, and some, being partly so, also rang true, but nonetheless it was the view of Quintus Metellus that prevailed. Metellus agreed with Maximus on everything else, but he disagreed on Scipio. Here was a man, he said, whom the state had recently chosen, very young though he was, as its sole commander for the recovery of Spain. And then, when Spain was recovered from the enemy, it had elected him consul to bring the Punic War to an end. He was the man on whom the state had pinned its hopes of drawing Hannibal from Italy and bringing Africa to heel. How did it make sense to recall him peremptorily from the area of responsibility, virtually condemned like Quintus Flaminius before he had stated his case? And to do that, when the Locrians stated that the atrocities committed against them took place when Scipio was not even there, and when the only charge that could be brought against him was that of showing leniency or restraint in sparing his legate. His own view, he said, was that Marcus Pomponius, the praetor to whom Sicily had been allotted as his sphere of command, should leave for his province within 3 days. The consuls should use their own discretion to choose 10 representatives from the Senate to send with the praetor, and they should also send 2 tribunes of the plebs and an aedile. With these, as the advisory body, the praetor should conduct an inquiry. And if the events that were the basis of the Locrians' complaints proved to have taken place on the orders of Publius Scipio, or with his acquiescence, they should order him to quit the area of responsibility. If Publius Scipio had already crossed to Africa, the tribunes of the plebs and the aedile, and 2 of the senatorial representatives whom the praetor thought most suitable for the job, should leave for Africa. The mission of the tribunes of the plebs and the aedile would be to bring Scipio back from there, and that of the 2 representatives to take command of the army until such time as the new commander reached that army. If the findings of Marcus Pomponius and the 10 representatives were that those actions had not been ordered or sanctioned by Publius Scipio, then Scipio should stay with the army and prosecute the war as he had proposed. A decree of the Senate was passed to the effect, and an agreement was reached with the tribunes of the plebs, that they should arrange between them, or choose by sortition, which 2 should accompany the praetor and the legates. The matter of expiatory ceremonies relating to the items in the temple of Proserpina that had been touched, defiled, and removed was referred to the College of Pontiffs. Marcus Claudius Marcellus and Marcus Cincius Alimentus were the tribunes of the plebs who left with the praetor and the 10 representatives. An aedile of the plebs was also assigned to them. Should Scipio still be in Sicily and refuse to obey the praetor's command or if they had already crossed to Africa, the tribunes were to order the aedile to seize him, and, by the right conferred by their sacrosanct office, they would bring them back to Rome. Their plan was to go to Locri before proceeding to Messana. As for Plaminius, there are two versions of the story. Some record that, when he heard what had transpired in Rome, he went into exile in Neapolis, and that on the way he happened to bump into Quintus Metellus, one of the senatorial representatives, and was brought back to Rhegium under duress by him. Others claim that a legate and 30 horsemen of the noblest families were sent out by Scipio himself to clap Quintus Flaminius in irons, and the other prime movers in the troubles along with him. Whether it was on Scipio's orders given earlier or the praetors at that time, all the men were handed over to the people of Rhegium to be kept under guard. The praetor and the representatives set off for Locri, where, first of all, following their instructions, they looked into the matter of religion. They searched out all the sacred money that was in the possession of Plaminius and the soldiers, and put it back in the treasury, adding a sum that they had themselves brought with them. They also held an expiatory ceremony. The praetor then called the common soldiers to an assembly, and ordered them to march out of the city. He established a camp for them on the plain, and issued a strict injunction against any soldier either remaining in the city or taking out with him goods that were not his own. He declared that he was now allowing the people of Locri to take whatever each of them recognized as his property, and to make a formal claim for anything that did not come to light. Before all else, he said it was his will that free persons be immediately restored to the Locrians, and anyone failing to restore them faced severe punishment. Pomponius next held an assembly of the Locrians. He told them about the Roman people and the Senate were restoring to them their independence and legal system, and that if any of them wished to prosecute Plaminius or anyone else, he should go with him to Rhegium. If they wished to lodge an official grievance about Publius Scipio, charging that the outrageous acts in Locri against gods and men had taken place on Publius Scipio's orders, or with his acquiescence, they should send spokesmen to Messana, and he would hold an enquiry there with his board of advisers. Thanking the praetor and his legates and the Senate, the people of Rome, the Locrians declared that they would make the journey to prosecute Plaminius in the case of Scipio. However, although he had shown insufficient concern for the wrongs done to their community, he was still the sort of man they would rather have as a friend than an enemy, and they were quite sure that all the execrable crimes had not been committed on his orders or with his acquiescence. Scipio had either placed too much confidence in Plaminius and too little in them, or else it was that natural tendency some people have of not wishing to see wrong done, but when not having the will to punish the wrongs when they have been done. The praetor and his advisory board were thus spared the not inconsiderable task of conducting an inquiry into Scipio's case. They found Plaminius guilty, and about 32 others along with him, and they sent them off to Rome in chains. They themselves proceeded to Scipio so they could, with their own eyes, verify the widespread rumors about the general's dress and idleness and his slipshod military discipline, and then take their findings to Rome. 22. While the delegation was en route for Syracuse, Scipio prepared to clear his name, not with words but action. He gave orders for the entire army to muster in the city, and for the fleet to be made ready for action, just as though they had to fight the Carthaginians that day on land and sea, on the day of their arrival. Pomponius and his party were given a hospitable welcome, and the day after that Scipio put on a display of his land and sea armies, not simply drawn up in formation, but with the infantry performing their maneuvers, and the fleet also staging a mock naval battle in the harbor. Then the praetor and the legates were taken around to inspect the arsenals, storehouses, and other military preparations. So impressed were they for each feature, and by the whole ensemble, that they were convinced that the defeat of the Carthaginian people would be achieved by the general and his army, and by no other. With a wish that the gods grant him success, they bade him cross to Africa and bring to fruition, at the earliest possible moment, the hopes the Roman people placed in him on the day all centuries declared him consul ahead of all others. Such was the joy in their hearts when they left Sicily, that it was as if the news they would be taking to Rome was not merely of outstanding preparations for the conflict, but of victory already won. On their arrival in Rome, Flaminius and the others charged along with him were immediately thrown in jail. When they were first hailed before the people by the tribunes, they found no room for pity in minds that were already filled with the sufferings of the Locrians. Later on, as their appearances became more frequent, anger cooled and passion subsided, and Flaminius's own mutilated features and the memory of the absent Scipio began to generate some sympathy with the crowd. However, Flaminius died in jail before his trial, before the people could be concluded. In the third book of his Roman history, Claudius Licinius records that this Flaminius, through the agency of some men whom he had bribed, attempted arson in several parts of the city during games that Scipio Africanus was, in his second consulship, staging in Rome in fulfillment of a vow. The aim was to give Flaminius an opportunity of breaking out of prison and making his escape. But the crime subsequently came to light according to Licinius, and by decree of the Senate he was consigned to the Tullianum. The only proceedings taking with regard to Scipio were in the Senate. There everybody, legates and tribunes alike, spoke in praise of the fleet, the army, and the leader, prompting the Senate to vote for the crossing to Africa to be made at the earliest possible time. They also voted that Scipio be permitted his choice of the armies in Sicily. He could decide which he would take with him to Africa, and which he would leave to garrison his province. 23. While this was taking place on the Roman side, the Carthaginians had passed a nervous winter, with observation posts established on all their promontories. They had been gathering intelligence and becoming perturbed with every piece of news that arrived. But they also added to their military preparations something of no little significance for the defense of Africa, namely an alliance with King Sphax. For the Carthaginians thought it was thanks to their confidence in Sphax that the Romans were about to cross to Africa. As was observed above, Hasdrubal, son of Gisgo, had a bond of hospitality with the king, which dated from the occasion when Scipio and Hasdrubal both happened to come to him at just the same time. But there had also been preliminary mention of a marriage connection, to the king marrying Hasdrubal's daughter. To bring this to fruition and fix a date for the wedding, the girl being already of marriageable age, Hasdrubal set off to visit the king. Now, Numidians are particularly sensual people, more so than all other barbarians, and when Hasdrubal noted that Sphax's libido was aroused, he sent for the girl from Carthage and pushed the wedding ahead, and so that a bond between the states could be added to the private pact, an oath was taken amid the general exchange of congratulations confirming the alliance between the people of Carthage and the king, with promises given on both sides that they would have the same friends and enemies. Hasdrubal, however, kept in mind the fact that the king had also struck an alliance with Scipio, and that barbarians are by nature undependable and capricious, and he feared that if Scipio crossed to Africa, the marriage would prove a flimsy connection. Accordingly, while he had the Numidian aflame with his new infatuation, he induced him, with some gentle coaxing from the girl as well, to send envoys to Scipio in Sicily. Through these he was to advise Scipio that he should not make his crossing to Africa relying on Sphax's earlier assurances, for he now had a marriage connection with a Carthaginian citizen, a daughter of the Hasdrubal, whom Scipio had seen as a guest in his home. In addition, he now had a formal pact with the Carthaginian people. His primary wish, therefore, was that the Romans conduct their war with the Carthaginians as they had done to that time far away from Africa, and not oblige him to become embroiled in their conflict, militarily supporting one side and reneging on his alliance with the other. If Scipio would not stay away from Africa, and if he brought his army up to Carthage, then he, Sphax, would be obliged to fight for the land of Africa, his own birthplace, and also for the fatherland of his wife, and for her father and her home.